As you can probably tell, I am not Mark Clay. He is still en route in the air right now, and if he lands in time and makes his way over here, he will join us towards the end of the panel. My name is Kevin Berg. I'm the Secretary and Treasurer for the Pedagogy Studies Group, and so on behalf of this group, it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. The name of this session is Experimenting with the Canon, New Approaches to the Music History Survey. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is unceded territory to the Coast Salish peoples, including territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Stolo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Innovation in teaching of music history sometimes results from departure curricular reviews and campus-wide mandates. But new ideas appear every day in the single classroom, where individual instructors confronting the challenge of inspiring a classroom full of eager, or maybe not so eager young scholars, and inspired by the musical material that they love, routinely retool content, assessments, activities, and purpose to nurture learning. For this evening's panel, 4 of these instructors, each rooted in different educational environments, will share their experiences in experimenting with the most traditional of our discipline's course structures, the Music History Survey. Their goal is to spark conversation by offering observations rooted in concrete pedagogical examples. In order of appearance tonight, our 4 pedagogical speakers for this evening are Vilda Aslid, Gwen Cooner-Brown, Ryan Paul Banagale, and John Spilker. I found out about half an hour ago that I'm doing this. So. I'm very honored. I'm I'm excited for this session. So I'm happy to jump at the opportunity. Our overall goal for this session is not to offer answers so much as to explore questions, share ideas, and with a bit of luck, inspire all of us to experiment with the Music History Survey in our own teaching. To accomplish this, we are not going to have a 3-hour panel. Instead, we are going to alternate between discussion and presentation. So I need to emphasize that your role in tonight's session is not a passive one. Sorry. As much fun as it would be to sit around and lecture about how we shouldn't be lecturing to our students. To get us off on the right participatory note, we are going to begin tonight by breaking up into groups to share some preliminary thoughts on the Music History Survey. I'm back. So everybody, stand up. Form a group of 3, which means find 2 other people. 2 other people. Not just anyone.
Hello. So I currently teach in a system where we have 1 full year of survey. And Jeffrey Block in our group went from 1 year to 2 years of survey. And when he said this, I was very interested in why. And he said, well, one day the performers and the faculty, we were in a retreat, and they asked for more history. And I said, how did you do that? And it dawned on me that the more we can communicate to our colleagues the relevance of what we do, not just to why we think it's relevant, but why it's relevant to them, that they might even ask us for more. And when they do, we can say yes. I thought that was remarkable.
You cannot convince your colleagues. How will you convince your students? All right, how about from this side of the room?
All right, I'll go. So we had also a great conversation. Great thing about the group is we have an expert in the group. And then we have a wonderful master's student in TKIT. So great, and then there's a professor. So it's a sort of an interesting, group of people talking. And
y'all hear me? So, Tim, my new friend here, we were talking about one of the big problems of just how exactly your institution may vary. I'm coming from Indiana University, which is technically a school of music, but in many ways it's more of a conservatory bent. There is a heavy emphasis on performance, a heavy emphasis on training for a professional world. Tim is working at a largely liberal arts school. And he told me quite a bit about how the students in his classes like to look at scores, look at primary sources, figure out questions like, why are all the instrumental parts in German? And then apply skills from that kind of analysis to other subjects. One of the roadblocks that I personally had in the more conservatory bent setting is, what use do I have of that? I have had many a student who said to me, why do I need to know that sort of thing? And a performance decision is an historical decision, as I know Peter has mentioned in years past. But why should music history professors, why should musicologists be the one giving that to them in a conservatory when the performers themselves or the teachers themselves can actually be the more trustworthy sources according to the students? So on some level, maybe that is one of the roadblocks of working in a more performance-oriented setting. It's saying, we can contribute something to how you can perform this piece, and to do so in a way that is a little different from a teacher bent or a pedagogical bent, but from a more critical bent. How you do that, it's anybody's guess, but I think that is something that Tim and I kind of played around with, and I think it was valuable.
Thank you. We have time for one more. Yes?
One thing we talked about in our group back there was the kind of silly, speedy nature of surveys. This feeling of, say, having to, this awkward quality of rushing through a few hundred years and what kind of story we're telling when we do that. And coming out, and at least for me, coming out of a 2-year survey thinking, well, how useful was that story, not just for performers, but for anybody trying to get a liberal arts education, moving into any facet of society. The disconnect, I think the last point that Kenneth says is sort of disconnect between, say, the story that we tell through a survey and how to do history through a survey versus how we actually expect to do music history as historians, and then sort of misalignment that sometimes comes up between those two things.
Great, thank you for sharing that. I think that resonates with me in particular, because anytime that you get caught up in that timetable and it becomes an obligation for you, then you're modeling a behavior that what your students are running is also an obligation. And when it comes from that angle, sometimes it's difficult to inspire, and that can be challenging. So thank you for sharing that last thought for this session. What we're going to do now is we're going to move in to the first two of our speakers. And look around you. Don't forget the group you were in, because you're going to come back to this group. If you need to exchange cards, email addresses, Twitter handles, whatever, so you don't forget who they are. After our first two presenters, we will return to our groups, and then we will have our final two speakers after a second discussion period. And since I have the microphone, I will also remind you, for those of you in the pedagogy group here, we do have a hashtag that's specific. It's AMSPSG. So if you are tweeting about this session, please use that hashtag as well, so we can archive it as part of the discussion. So we will move on to our first half of our speakers. They want to come forward. So our first speaker is Gilda Aslet, who is an interdisciplinary music scholar with interests in text and improvisation. She completed her PhD in critical and comparative
with a dissertation on the intersection of jazz and poetry. Her article on Charles Mingus recently appeared in the Journal of the Society for American Music, and she is currently writing a book that examines the cultural and aesthetic interrelation of improvised music and poetry. Vilde is also an active performer of the Norwegian Hardanger fiddle and a practitioner of traditional Norwegian singing and dancing. She is now assistant professor of music at the University of Rhode Island. Please join me in welcoming to the microphone, Vilde.
I'm super impressed at how many people are here for an evening session. This is a commitment to teaching right here. Look, I'm gonna adjust. No, I'm not. Okay. So, like many of us in this room, I'm sure I have an ongoing project of broadening what goes into a music history course, and especially of improving the representation of women and people of color in my teaching. Today, I'd like to think a bit about how the process of deciding what gets included in a music history course influences how we present that material. When broadening what gets included, there's a distinct risk of tokenism and othering discourses creeping into the classroom, undermining the very goal of the inclusion. In my experience, course objectives can be a powerful locus of the exclusionary narratives that have created the need for this broadening in the first place. Now, I don't know how you relate to your course objectives. Maybe they're the first thing you write when developing a course, or maybe there's something that you draft just before sending off your course proposal to the curricular committee. But today I'd like to take them seriously as a structuring force in our teaching. I'll give two brief examples from my own courses, first at Brooklyn College and then at UC of Rhode Island, and hope to continue this thread of discussion with you all as the evening progresses. So, Brooklyn College. This was not a music history survey, it was the undergraduate non-major course that was sort of, the music appreciation course, right? But I think a lot of the things that I did in this course would be applicable in a survey setting. It had the intimidatingly broad title of Music, Its Language, History, and Culture. It was required as part of the core curriculum for the undergraduates. They had to choose between this course and an Intro to Art History course. So everyone was taking this course, almost about half the people, right? It was non-majors and music majors took the course, but the music majors had their own sort of sequestered section. Pros and cons of that, definitely. And so when I was hired to teach this course, I was an adjunct when I was doing this, and so I was provided with a shell syllabus that sort of said, here's basically what we would like you to do now, and gave me a lot of freedom, which was a wonderful thing to have. So the shell syllabus came with 7 course objectives. So that's a lot. Here's one of them. Students will be able to identify and describe the salient features of the music of the Western European Repertory from the Middle Ages to the present. That's one. Now I want to point out that anything I have to say about shortcomings of the course in relation to the objectives is on me, right? So it's how you deal with these things to a certain extent too. So it's it's not a Two. Students. I don't have to read it, right? And 3. So these were 3 of the 7 objectives. So it's a tall order, and yet it captures some, as impossible as this is, it captures something which is important, right? Which is, if we're doing a course titled Music, Its Language, History, and Culture, it has to be broader than Objective 1. What was clear, though, in the structuring of these objectives is that it started as just one, right? If you had gone back 15 years ago, that would have been the course objective for this course. And then we realized, oh, okay, and 2 came, and then 3 came, right? So it's a fundamentally additive structure here. We increased and increased what was supposed to be included, and that's laudable, right? We should be very excited about the inclusion that is happening in the expansion of these course objectives. So here's how I handled this. I did thematic units, organized around these ideas: music and word, music and spectacle, music and dance, large ensemble instrumental music, and small ensemble instrumental music. And then within each of these units, we had a key piece that we would spend at least 2 class meetings on and go into depth. This is where we would talk about structures and forms and get them familiar with use of musical vocabulary and that kind of thing, and think about performance context of that individual piece. So this would be the depth. I would have a chronology day where we would sort of zoom through the Western European tradition, visiting each style period within that theme. Then we would have one day where we studied an example of that theme from popular music, and one example from that theme in a traditional music from outside the United States. So we did this for each of the 5 units. It was super fun to put together and design and dream up. So sometimes this worked really well. Some of the units especially were very effective. Music and word worked, I think, probably best of all. We started with sort of an in-depth conversation about music and language as different systems of meaning and what happens when they combine in song and other kinds of combined contexts. We studied Die Winterreise was our key piece for that, and they got sort of into the nitty-gritty of song analysis and thinking about those 2 systems of meanings interacting. We read Kofi Agawu, 19th century, the analysis of 19th century Lied, not the whole thing, but the first part where he sort of outlines the different ways that they come together, not the analysis part. And so that was Die Winterreise. Then we went to Son Jarocho, a form from Veracruz in Mexico, and talked about improvised decimas as a sort of community commentary and the way that that was functioning. And then we closed with hip hop. And what was great about this was they are super familiar with, this is Brooklyn College, right? They were super familiar with hip hop, but they were at this point primed to listen to that music in a very different way and think about it with a very different lens. So we went then through a quick history of hip hop where we were talking about shifting importance of DJing and MCing and what that has to do with music and language. And then also sort of shifting values in flow over time and how the flow was interacting with the music. So this worked pretty well. The large ensemble instrumental unit also worked quite well. We studied Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and thought about the work concept. We discussed Duke Ellington and group composition, so this was sort of probing ideas of the composer, the arranger, and then we closed with Trinidadian steel pan ensembles and the importance of arrangement in that context. So, that went well. But other things had some problems. There were several parts of the course where the Western canon still held a kind of gravitational sway that surprised me. Although the knowledge of that canon was only one of the several course objectives, it held a primary position in sort of how the course was coming together. It was the thing onto which other things had been added, and I think it was clear in how the course progressed. Yes, there were other objectives, but the hierarchy was there. The structural underpinnings of the course were fundamentally exclusionary, and I found myself constantly maneuvering through a minefield of othering and tokenism that I had laid myself. Yes, we had a fantastic class meeting on Beyonce's VMA performance and feminism in the Music and it was more or less a standalone class. When I was trying to prepare an answer for why we were studying this example, I found myself kind of struggling. Why? I don't know. It's important. But why? It wasn't a terrible outcome. The students seemed blissfully unaware of my angsty churning. And the evaluations even praised the course for avoiding Eurocentrism, which was a first for me to get that kind of feedback from students. But it could have been better. And I think that with a better set of objectives, I might have had easier answers to my qualms. So, the big blank slide. To University of Rhode Island. So now I am teaching music history survey, and I am solely in charge of music history at University of Rhode Island. So I get to make all the decisions, which is great fun. And I want to talk about what I'm doing with Music History 3 right now. This is 20th and 21st century. It is also supposed to include jazz and popular music and folk music. So it has a similar sort of big tent idea of music in the 20th and 21st century. So what I am doing is I'm using skills-based course objectives. And this is obviously not brand new, right? But, so my course objective is just one of them, is to train my students in asking culturally and historically informed questions about music in the 20th and 21st century, and learn how to answer them. So, the surprise for me in this was how this approach has made the breadth of material that we cover in the class hang together without calling up tokenism and othering discourses. It really has been surprising to me. So I thought up some themes that I wanted to convey about 20th and 21st century. I want to talk about migration, relationship with the past, both real and imaginary, and technology. The course is chronological, and maybe you can read most of that. This is how it goes. You can see that I'm not separating by genre or anything like that. It's mostly chronological. There are a couple of paired classes, and these are the places where it's most popping through how this kind of tokenism and othering discourse is not appearing in the classroom. So I want to focus on the pair of classes that are about folklorism. So in the first of them, we talk about lead belly. And I have them read Benjamin Filing's chapter on lead belly and the cult of authenticity. And we think about the Lomaxes and the way that they collected material. We look at a lot of photos and videos and thinking about what that folklore was about. And then we talk about Blind Boy Paxton. I don't know if anyone, do you guys know Blind Boy Paxton? No? He's this current blues and old-time performer who dresses in very much the way the Lomaxes dressed Lead Belly, and does this whole maybe character, maybe not performance. So we looked at video of this and thought about the cult of authenticity in 2016 and what that has to do with folklore in relationship to the past. And then with Bela Bartok, we read some of his own writings about ethnographic collection of materials and the use of folk music in art music contexts. And we listened to Mikrokosmos 6, the dances in Bulgarian rhythm, and thought about what it means to take that material and put it into this context. Their essays on the exam were incredible. It was clear that they really got this and were generating deep, insightful thoughts about what folklore is in the 20th century and what it might have to do with the relationship to a real and imagined past. So I've been surprised at how much smoother the Music History 3 course has gone, how much easier and unproblematic it has been to move between genres, and how much more resonance there has been between the topics. The Brooklyn College course was just as inclusive in terms of the percentage of the material that was made by women and people of color, but the underlying narratives of the course were much narrower. I'm excited about how things are going at the University of Rhode Island, but I'm guessing that in another year I'll have a whole new set of critiques, so stay tuned. But I'm left with the sense that building my course on a skills-based objective has significantly shifted my ability to broaden my content without engaging these tokenistic and othering discourses. So I want to sort of prompt you and say that I'm left wondering, what course objectives as a structuring force have you found to work well in your music history survey courses, and how that serves this broader goal of inclusion in the music history survey? So thank you.
So we'll move on to our second presentation, and then we will have our second discussion, where a lot of these ideas that are coming up in presentations will have a chance to discuss in your small groups. Our second presenter is Gwen Cooner-Brown, who serves as Associate Professor at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, where she teaches classes for music majors and non-majors in music history, music theory, and world music. Gwen is also a classical pianist and plays the Shonan Lira. Her work has appeared in the Journal of the Society for American Music and the collection Blackness in Opera. She has conducted archival research on 20th century arrangers of African American religious folk music, including Ava Jesse, Hal Johnson, Chester Harrison, and especially William L. Dawson, about whom she is writing a book for the American Composers series of the University of Illinois Press. Please join me in welcoming Gwen Cooner-Brown.
Hello. I'm so inspired, Vilda, by your comments. I just want to hide in a corner and think about them and not talk to myself. I should also mention this is my bedtime. So I'm going to talk about the curriculum at the University of Puget Sound, and Mark, you already alluded to my wonderful colleague Jeffrey Block talking about how we got to expand the what used to be a 2-semester survey that over the course of 2 semesters, my colleague Jeffrey Block would cover everything from the music of the dinosaurs up to the present, and I just checked with him right before the session, and he said that he did manage to squeeze in some jazz history, so it wasn't just Western classical music. And now we have a 4-semester sequence. So the 4th semester isn't part of a survey. It's a special topic seminar, so it's a wonderful separate thing. But we now have a 3-semester survey. So the first 2 semesters are Music 230 and 231, and what I've got here is the course description for 231, just to give you a sense of what Jeffrey does so beautifully. Surveys music history, tracing the development of Western musical styles, genres, and ideas from the late 18th classical style. That's great we should have fixed that on the website. Of Haydn, Mozart, 19th century romanticism, from Beethoven to Mahler, the birth of modernism. He goes up to Rite of Spring. And then he created for me a 3rd semester to teach the music 333. And I was hired right at the time when this class came into being, so it's kind of, he created it and wrapped it in a box and gave it to me, and I feel like I get to do all the fun stuff. So this is my class, a survey of music history of the classical and popular traditions from World War I to the present, and an introduction to world music. Topics include the legacy of modernism, neoclassicism, the post-World War II avant-garde, postmodernism, jazz and popular music, and representative non-Western traditions, which is a lot of fun stuff to take on. And so thinking about how to do this, and as you were describing, Vilda, additive, it definitely has this additive quality to it. And this list of isms and whatnot, a lot of these are Western classical isms, and then we get to jazz and popular music and representative non-Western traditions. And the part that prompted me to start thinking a little bit creatively about this was the non-Western traditions, because as soon as you're doing all of these things and also saying something about the rest of the world, just the impossibility of representing the world, it really sort of hits you in the face. And so given theorists and ethnomusicologists approach musics of different sorts, and to really keep that how of scholarship in the forefront in this class. So I do approach it in 3 units, and it's possible to critique those boundaries, and thinking about thematic approaches is very inspiring. But we do these 3 units, we do spend a week on popular music with a similar sort of approach, but very condensed. So we start with jazz history, then we do scare quotes for so classical music, and then non-Western music. And originally, the first few times I taught this class, I started with classical music, and my thought was, well, so music 230 and 231, and then you finish the Western narrative, and then you add on. That's not good. And then in overtime, right, the extra innings, you do jazz. So the reason it got switched is not because I had this high-minded idea, but because one of the readings I use in the jazz unit is by Angela Davis, and she was coming to campus to give a talk in our race and pedagogy event that happens every 4 years. So I wanted to be sure the students had heard of Angela Davis and read her stuff before she came to campus, so they could all get excited and attend her talk. And I discovered in doing that, for that very pragmatic reason, that it solved a problem I hadn't really thought about having, which is the problem of feeling like we've finished the important stuff when we finish the classical music, right? So I've tucked it this way, even though Angela Davis does not keep coming to our campus. And it's worked out really, really nicely, and I think it changes our mindset to start talking about jazz, because some of the issues are different. So when I do the jazz history unit, a couple of readings we do early on. One is by Brian Harker, whose work on Louis Armstrong is so amazing and so the trade-offs in terms of pedagogy. And so the students, many of whom are going to go on in music education, get to think about, okay, what's important here? Is it important to have this sort of tangible, safe narrative in a sense of, yes, I understand and I can lay it out? Or is it important to think about how jazz and jazz historiography fit into our world and our reality? So there's a lot of critical thinking about not only musicology, but about pedagogy. In the classical unit, we take a similar approach. A couple of readings I really, really love, and it's a similar kind of idea. Richard Taruskin's Why You Cannot Leave Bartok Out, which is a beautiful speech he gave following the Cambridge History of 20th Century Music, leaving out Bartok. Oops. So it raises beautiful issues of historiography and also ethics. It's a very impassioned and eloquent and spiky speech, and the students really enjoy it. I also give them things like Paul Epstein's analysis of piano phase, which takes us out of just thinking about minimalism as a kind of technique, a cool process that you set into motion and it goes, but what can you do with that as an analyst, as a music theorist? So again, this broad spectrum of approaches. So we're still going chronologically, we still talk about big isms along the way, but every time we're also being very intentional and explicit about how are people writing about this music, what are the choices they're making, what decisions are they making about what to focus on, what to leave out. What I just said. So I find that students, they love chronology. It makes them feel safe and happy. So I don't throw it out because I do think it's valuable, especially when you're being so frank about your pedagogical choices and how it's all constructed. At least chronology will not betray me. This is a major theme. The music history is created by people with values and agendas and personalities. And I foreground my own identity as a scholar. I'm very frank that the readings we talk about because they move me. I find them useful and interesting or infuriating in a few cases. I share with them why I love analysis, why I love music history, what I try to do myself as a scholar, the things that are important to me, the reasons I went into this crazy business in the first place. And I also try to highlight that they also play a role, not only as consumers of academic discourse about music, but as musicians and scholars and performers and teachers, that they also have a role in shaping this. So hopefully this is empowering and keeps them from feeling like they're just being sort of frog marched through this inexorable process. So the assignments that I give in this class include, I asked them to do for the jazz unit a critical essay, relatively short, but just evaluating, saying which of the readings we've done really speak to you and why? Which approaches seem to you most valuable given your understanding of the musical and political issues around jazz scholarship? In the classical unit, I have them do annotated bibliography. I asked them to find a good, juicy scholarly controversy. Everyone wants to choose Shostakovich. But they find a scholarly controversy. I don't ask them to write a full term paper, but to sort of do the groundwork for a hypothetical term paper. And sometimes they are very excited by evidence that indeed these scholars are people, and sometimes they get riled up and they really disagree and they really go at each other about some issues. So again, it sort of humanizes. They do an archival research project. We've got a lovely archive on campus, the papers of Leroy Ostransky, who was a pioneering jazz history pedagogue, and many other things. So they get a little taste of what it means to engage with archival sources and the frustrations and excitements of that process. At the end of the semester, they do a very small fieldwork project. They read a little bit from Bruno Nettle's Heartland Excursions, where he turns his ethnomusicological eyes on an amalgam of major Midwestern schools of music. And I have them read the section where he talks about the pecking order among the pianists and the singers and the instrumentalists, and they all get really angry. And then they started looking around them at the various dynamics in our school of music, and I learned all the dirt from that. So these fundamental questions, I hope, are at the center of what I do in this class. What do you want musicology, music history, music theory, the academic study of music? What are the things that this can do for you, the student? It's not just something that you're forced to read and write about and regurgitate on a test, but it's a living conversation that you have an active role to play in. What can it do, idealistically, what can it do for the world, for social justice, for inclusion, for all of these beautiful things that I think we're all committed to? What work remains to be done? And I thought I would conclude with an assignment that I created for that 400 level special topics seminar. Some years back, I did a special topic on African American music in the concert hall. And so we did all sorts of different units on concert spirituals, African American composers of symphonies, jazz at Carnegie Hall was a unit. But right at the beginning of the semester, I asked the students on the second day of class to bring a book from the library. And it should be on a broad topic, like 20th century music or music in America, some book that purports to be kind of encyclopedic about some topic. And I asked them to bring in their book and be prepared to present it to the class, just talk about what's the coverage of African American music. And it was stunning how little in these books that claim to be about all the music in the 20th century, all of American music, how limited the coverage of African American music was. And the students were so incensed and animated and ready to jump in and right this wrong. It was just a beautiful start for the class. So I think anything one can do to create a sense for the students that this is a living thing that is imperfect as it stands, and there's still so much work to be done by anyone who cares about music. Stop. Thank you.
So before we have our second group discussion, small group discussion, we do have a time set aside for some Q&A for our first two speakers for Build It Win. Certainly some great ideas about how we can be critical of the canon, how we can embrace it, but embrace it in a way that we are being transparent to our students and showing them what's behind the curtain. So we'll take some questions from the floor. And please, microphone here.
Can I just project? I have a loud voice.
I know you do, John. We have our room monitor.
Hi, question for Mildred. You said that you made your second class more skills-based, but I don't think you told us what the objectives were.
Oh,
So could you please read those?
Yeah.
Thanks.
I should have put it on a slide. That's what the blank slide was for. The objective, there's just one of them. It's to train the students in asking culturally and historically informed questions about music of the 20th and 21st century and learn how to answer them. So I wanted to give them enough context about the time that they could know what kinds of questions would be important, and then to sort of model the process of asking those questions and going and finding the answers. So they don't do papers, but they do a research presentation where they go and define a research topic that's adjacent to the topic of the day, but not exactly that topic. And then they go and they look in Grove and they look in Rome and they look at a couple other places and they come back and sort of say, here is the research question that I would ask if I were going to go and do a paper. And as the semester has been going on, their questions have been getting better and better, hopefully because of what we're doing in the actual classroom. But yeah, it's about training them to ask and then answer their own questions about the music of that time period.
Next question, we have the microphone going around.
I could see how, Vilda, your second class made that move, and I know that what we're seeing here is just, a fragment of what really happened over a whole course. But as a folklorist, as well as an ethnomusicologist, I'm thinking that even that is not fail-safe at all. To equivocate, sorry, it's my bedtime too. To equate world music with folk music is not true. There's of course classical traditions around the world, as well as many popular traditions around the world. So to separate popular from folk, from world, from classical is problematic. And as well, those two particular researchers, Lomax and Bartok, who were from outsider hegemonic majority group populations, and acquiring folk music for use in their hegemonic majority traditions. Were you able to discuss that in class?
Yes. Which was so great. Yeah, because it's folklorism, not folklore, right? And so we talk about what was prompting them to make this move, what kinds of relationships with the past, and then what traditional music might have to do with pastness for them at that point in history, right? So we poke at that. Yes, okay, I don't want to forget all the things I want to respond to, because really great comment, right? So in my music history 1 survey course, which I didn't talk about at all today, it's supposed to start with world music. And we start the first day of class with critiquing world music as a construct, right? And then we spend that time, that's constantly there throughout that, I'm hoping, because I've only done number 1, but I'm hoping that they take that critique with them throughout all 3 semesters of the survey. So yeah, it's about zooming in and then zooming out and trying to place the things as individuals doing these maneuvers that they're doing, and then trying to place that into the time and place of why would they be doing this at this time. Not trying to, I also want to clarify that when I do these pairs, the folklorism, the neoclassicism, I'm blanking on the other pair I do. Experimentalism, thank you. It's explicitly about the contrast between the members of that pair and what you can bring out about those ideas through that contrast. So, yeah.
Next question. Well, I think this would be a great time for us to generate some more thoughts for our presenters as we discuss amongst ourselves in our small groups and share which tokenism card-carrying members we have in this room. And I will give you, I'd say, about 10 minutes, and we have a slide with some instructions. Yes. What was this?
Just real quickly, I made a handout of the readings I mentioned in my talk, and I've made about 20, so if folks wanted those, feel free to come grab one, or just email me and I can send it to you.
So our 2 instructions for the second discussion in your small groups: what forces of resistance might you encounter if you change the music history survey at your school? And how might you address these concerns? 10 minutes.
Colleagues when we were talking about possibly shortening the survey or changing it substantially, my colleagues were most concerned about the issue of coverage. So how can my student on X instrument go to grad school not having studied Clemens Nampala, or not having studied Jacob Ogreff, God forbid, and that's a legitimate concern, and it represents a larger concern, which is when you cut time from your survey, you are cutting some of the coverage that music historians have traditionally promised. And so I addressed those concerns by suggesting that students were quite adept at learning about these composers on their own if necessary, but I also suggested that if they failed their music history entrance exams in grad school, which is a big concern, that it might not be the worst thing in the world for them to take more music history classes, which was hard for my colleagues to disagree with. So.
Next comment from discussion, yes.
State University, we were talking a lot about the territoriality of the repertoires that we cover. And so I imagine some of you, or many of you, teach in institutions where performance dominates the discussion. And I know, at least in my case, my colleagues take my word for it on what skills I want my students to develop in the classroom. But I think that I would need to have a very nuanced conversation about the changes in the repertoire, because those are repertoires that are held dear by my performing colleagues. And so I think there's a sort of negotiation that has to go on. That was a big part of our discussion. Who's taking this?
Yeah. You can use this mic right here.
A topic that came up in our group was NASM accreditation and a faulty understanding of what is actually required under NASM guidelines held over faculty like Damocles' sword. You can't possibly make these changes because we'll lose our accreditation.
And there was a great discussion of that a couple years ago, which is archived in the Journal of Music History Pedagogy, discussing those NASM accreditation standards. Definitely check it out, making a plug for the journal. The comments. I wasn't in the group, but I was thinking a little bit about the topic of coverage, and I think that for me, when I'm talking to my students, I always am trying to be very honest with them, because for a long time, I think I gave off this anxiety over coverage. And the students, they're like children or dogs. They smell fear, and they can smell anxiety. And I think that it caused more problems, than anything in the world. So it was when I was able to let go, or to also remember that, like there's not one canon, there are many canons. There's not one history, there are many histories. There's not one story, there's many stories that we can tell. And I think that when we're honest with our students about that, as our presenters have showed, we have to look very closely at the concept of a canon, whether we're presenting one and showing them the underpinnings of it, or we are actually involving them and putting one together for that class in a way. We're showing how this canon is addressing all these different curricular angles, that when we have that kind of honesty with our students, that we're able to really model for them the kind of critical thought towards history and towards what we're teaching that we want them to have. If we submit to a canon or a curricular chase, what are we modeling for our students when we do that? Any other comments from these small groups? I'm sure there will be a lot at the end of this session, or a big discussion. So we'll go ahead and move on to our final two presenters. Our third presenter, Ryan Paul Banagale, is Assistant Professor of Music at Colorado College, where he offers classes on a range of American music topics, including musical theater, jazz, popular music, bluegrass, and media studies. He received his PhD at Harvard University with the support of the American Musicological Society's AMS 50 and Howard Mayer Brown Fellowships. His dissertation became the foundation of his first book, Arranging Gershwin, Rhapsody in Blue and the Creation of an American Icon, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2014. He sits on the editorial board of the George Gershwin Critical Edition and will be editing 4 separate arrangements of Rhapsody in Blue for the endeavor. A strong proponent of making musicology accessible to non-academic audiences, he is co-host of the monthly radio program titled Critical Karaoke, as well as a daily 2-minute module called A Day in a Life. Ryan is a member of the newly established curatorial team for the American Musicological Society's blog, Musicology Now. Please see him if you have an idea for a publicly accessible post. Join me in welcoming Ryan.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction. We've been talking a lot about, in really wonderful ways, about
specifics within courses, changing what we're doing in the classroom, particularly with respect to courses that have a survey format to them. And what I want to look at here is what happens when we just get rid of it. Well, that's what we did. And so I want to think about the music history survey in terms of a larger curriculum, a larger curricular whole. And I'm speaking largely in terms of liberal arts education, and on a very specific academic schedule that we have at Colorado College called the Block Plan, and I'll explain that a little bit more later. But I think that my challenge to you is to kind of take what I'm saying and think about how you can apply that or fit it into what's happening at the variety of different schools or different curriculums that you have already in place. And what can you do within the structures that exist to maybe change or play with expectations or introducing some of the different skills. So the current year that we're in right now, and for us this is block 3 of the semester, is the start of a new music major at Colorado College. Like most curricular overhauls, ours was many years in the making. One of my colleagues at the Colorado College Music Department is Victoria Levine, and you may know her work on Native American music, but she's also become an expert on curricular offerings at liberal arts music departments. During the 2014-2015 academic year, she and a student research assistant undertook a sizable survey of music departments at a dozen small liberal arts colleges similar to ours at Colorado College. And that included Amherst, Bowdoin, Carleton, Davidson, Grinnell, Hampshire, McAllister, Pomona, Reed, Skidmore, Smith, and Williams. So her study, which is going to be published in a forthcoming Oxford University Press volume titled College Music Curricula for a New Century, its study documents several interesting trends in music education specific to small liberal arts departments. And I want to focus on one particular aspect that ended up driving our curricular overhaul. And it's one that ultimately will circle back to questions surrounding the music history survey. So the aspect I want to focus on here is the traditional major versus the compact major. The traditional major, as most of you know through experience, either where you've been schooled or where you are currently schooling, remains the most prevalent one. The traditional major is the most prevalent one in liberal arts departments. As many of us are probably familiar, such a structure is a holdover from the professionalization-oriented curricula set in place in the 1970s, majors that largely follow a conservatory-based model. In the 1980s and 1990s, we take the traditional Western focus that we received in history and theory, and we start adding to it, right? We start getting courses in world music, popular music, digital creativity. So it's again this kind of additive big tent problem that we start experiencing. So regardless of the exact outlay, the traditional major has a prescribed set of courses that unfold in sequence. And up here you can see some examples of the distributions of schools, including ours, our old major, Carleton, McAllister, Pomona, Skidmore, and Williams. And this chart is one that's in Professor Levine's article that will be coming out. The traditional models, as she defines it, tend to require 11 or more prescribed courses, and then 16 or more requirements as a whole, so lessons, ensembles, other requirements for the major. And these numbers are based here on actual courses and requirements rather than credit hours. That helps us kind of compare across different programs. Now you'll see a heavy dose in these traditional majors of theory and or history, and then all of them have a single world music course. There's elective course requirements here that range between 0 and 3, and then most of them also require a piano proficiency. So again, there's a bit of an emphasis here on the Western instrument, the piano. The strengths of this model, I think, really include its scaffolded approach to knowledge. We're building skills and information over time. It's allowing for particular tracks within the major, say focus on history or performance. But the structure itself doesn't necessarily make space for a lot of electives or customization. And that's a big thing in liberal arts education right now, is customization. What also it makes it difficult to do with this kind of structured approach is to make it makes it difficult for students to double major. And 50% of the majors at all of these colleges, there's a dozen colleges, 50% majors of the music majors are double majors. And furthermore, fewer than 40% of these majors pursue careers in music or go on to get advanced degrees in music after graduation. So kind of thinking, again, this very liberal artsy mode of what is a music degree, what should it be teaching, and in that the traditional approach doesn't necessarily lend itself to having as much expansive, it doesn't allow it to be expanding in directions that we might expect it. So increasingly departments, including my own, are moving towards another model, which is what we're calling the compact major. And here you see examples of compact major at Amherst, Bowdoin, Davidson, Grinnell, Hampshire, Reed, and Smith. And although it's not necessarily clear on this chart, these majors comprise of 10 or fewer prescribed courses, and then less than 18 requirements in total. The average number of requirements here is about 13. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a move away from the Western classical focus, but it allows for such possibilities. The removal of a piano proficiency requirement for all of these suggests such a shift. The compact major also allows for an increased number of electives. The average number here is 5, within a range of 2 up to 8, depending on the department. Now this increase, as I mentioned, allows individual student interests, it allows for greater customization. But of course it also requires a particularly close attention to advising. A lot of one-on-one work, which is something that the small liberal arts music departments can do, probably more readily than some of the larger schools of music, for example. So what I think such customization and flexibility allows is that in departments with a compact major, we become a little more agile, I think, with remapping the curriculum according to ongoing changes in the field of music, so particularly with respect to the music history survey. At least I hope that's the case, because Colorado College's new major is what I like to think of as a compact major plus. That is, within the prescribed courses, there's a great deal of flexibility. So we see here that by comparison to our old traditional model, our new compact major is actually has one more total requirement than before. We're moving from 12 requirements to 13, but it also reduces the theory requirement from 3 to 1, the Western history from 2 courses in a sequence to 1 general course about music history. It maintains the creativity and music and culture, aka ethnomusicology requirements for 1 course each, and then it adds required courses in popular music and performance-oriented studies. So this is our new kind of common core. It's 6 units in total. But of these 6, only one of these 6 is a dedicated required course, and that is the Western music theory course, what we're calling tonal harmony. The other 5 units each come with their own options. There's 4 courses on the books right now that could count for Western music history. There's 5 courses in music and culture. There's 4 courses in popular music, and 3 that count for creativity, and 3 that count for performance-oriented courses. And I should add that a majority of these courses are offered at the 200 level. That is, they have few or 0 prerequisites. So in addition to this kind of flexible core of 6 units, we require 5 units of electives. 2 of these have to be at the advanced seminar level. But folded in here could be, a unit, the electives could be a unit of private vocal instruction or participating in the bluegrass ensemble for a year. We've also relocated our senior seminar to the junior year and then dropped the piano proficiency. So I can unpack that further for you if you want me to during the Q&A period. But to return to our task at hand in the survey, I want to consider what this means for the music history survey. So such a sequence is not possible when students are just taking 1 block of theory or 1 block of history. And what I mean by blocks, this is the block plan. At Colorado College, students take 1 class at a time for 3.5 weeks. And the faculty also only teach 1 class at a time for 3.5 weeks. And by and large, we meet for 3 hours a day, maybe more. So it's very seminar, very intense, and very focused. It really, our kind of short model, what we say about it is that it emphasizes depth, not breadth. Right? You can really get into something, but you're never going to be able to cover all of it. And that was just a reality even before we changed the major, that 2 blocks of the Western history sequence going from medieval music to today in 7 weeks. I'm looking at you guys, some of the schedules you guys have, and I'm like, wow, I wish I had that much time to do all this stuff. But I think it speaks to that idea of include what you're going to include and what you're not, and to pretend that we still have a general canon that we need to speak to and give out all the time. I think that it's one of those things we've just never been able to do on the block plan at Colorado College. We've never been able to successfully have a sequence in 2 blocks. It's just not possible to go. You could go all the way through any given textbook, and it's still not enough time to get through everything there. So one of the things I wanted to also talk about is that a challenge for us too is that because it's 3 hours a day to students. These are not lecture-based courses. Obviously, it's very discussion-oriented. So we have to think about ways that we're going to integrate some of the different skills that you would get in a survey or receive over the course of a survey into a different kind of educational model within the liberal arts environment. So we've got 3 models that we follow. One's a type of course that incorporates integrative pedagogy, that is where 2 or more learning modes are utilized. So our performance-oriented courses fall in this category. For example, the bluegrass class that I co-teach, is part history and literature, part performance and ensemble work. So kind of coming at the subject from multiple modes, and then teaching them the different skills that they might get in the theory class, in Western theory, but then applying it and having that come into the classroom, say, singing intervals, singing part singing in bluegrass. Like how can you take some of those skills that might be located elsewhere in the canon and move it into a different course? The second type of course we like to do are project-based courses. So classes that undertake a collaborative, experience-based learning experience. In my medieval and Renaissance history course that I teach, I have students spend a week, which is a third of the class, a week transcribing, cataloging, and analyzing a Carmelite antiphonor that we just happen to have in our special collections. And I basically throw it at them and say, here's this, here's the Liber Usualis, not the same thing, but figure it out. And they've only really just been introduced to chant the day before. So it throws them right into the mix, and they really have to figure it out through the use of kind of a project. Same thing happened for me this last block. I taught a class on Billy Joel, and I had students assemble an exhibit based on a pile of somewhat random memorabilia. The exhibit was mounted for the Billy Joel conference, and it was attended by a majority of the 400 people that came to the event. And so for those of you that saw that, I saw the New York Times write-up that accompanied the conference, but the exhibit appears in those accompanying photos. So I mean, I had to tell my students, you're not always going to get your work featured in the Times. But it was, again, this project-based thing that forced them to think about, okay, how do we organize material, right? It's kind of like taking Billy Joel's career and creating a canon about it in some way, right? What are the important things to draw out? How do you experience it? How do you share and relate that information? So it really forced them to think in those kind of more meta terms about how we organize the past and present it in the present. The third type of course we do is field-based. So, for example, next year I'm planning a course on popular music history, which could be just a survey of pop music history, these pop history survey textbooks that I've used in the past. But we're going to travel, we're going to go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and we're going to spend 10 days there working in the archives, looking at what happens when you have to take, again, a kind of similar idea of the Billy Joel exhibit, taking material and present it to the public. I think there's a way of summing up here as we can get on to our final talk as well. One of the things that, as I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, is what we do at Colorado College is I think, I'm not going to say very unique because we can only say unique, but it is extra unique in that it is this academic schedule that presents its own challenges. And I guess what I would invite you to think about is, okay, this is similar to the idea that Bill was talking about with units, that you only have 3.5 weeks to cover something within a larger semester or larger quarter. How do you organize it? What do you do? And how do you get the students to actively own the material that they're working with? To then kind of be thinking about some of these larger issues that came up in the first couple of papers about ways that we have organized in the past, and now kind of what we're doing as we move into this new mode of dealing with music history sequence, or in our case, getting rid of it completely. What I don't have an answer to right now is how the different skills and subjects and coverage that we would have had, or that we used to have, even in a 7-week history course, where does that stuff line out now within the rest of the curriculum? Within those 6 core units, how do we divide out so that students are getting exposure to different genres, to different periods, to the different skills and approaches to analysis that we'd like them to have to experience the whole world of music beyond just what we have if we were just going to be teaching the Western history canon. I'll leave it at that, and thank you.
Our final speaker is John Spilker. In 2014, Nebraska Wesleyan University awarded John Spilker its annual Exemplary Teacher Award. John holds a PhD in musicology from Florida State University and is assistant professor of music at Nebraska Wesleyan University. where he also serves as the co-coordinator for the Campus Liberal Education Assessment Initiative, sponsored by the Higher Learning Commission. At the 2016 National Meeting of the Association of American Colleges and Universities, Dr. Spilker presented his work on music history, curricular revision, and integration with NWU's new liberal education program. His research on dissonant counterpoint and Henry Cowell has been published in American Music and the Journal of the Society for American Music. Please join me in welcoming John Spilker.
Gender and sexuality and music history of the environment. To provide you with some context for these new courses, I'd like to show you the pathway that our music majors follow. In their fourth semester, they take world music cultures, and this provides a framework for the connections between music and culture. The students receive instruction in participant observation fieldwork and in beginning library research. And then they apply these things to a semester-long fieldwork project with a local music culture in Lincoln, Nebraska. Music history, gender, and sexuality is in their fifth semester, and music history, the environment, their sixth semester. In these two courses, they receive instruction in information literacy skills using quality secondary sources. Their argument-based research paper requires them to utilize musicological research methods, including, among others, performance practice, social cultural context, compositional style, and musical analysis. And then in their seventh semester, they take the senior capstone seminar, which they can conduct research on any topic of interest that projects them forward to their next career step, including topics outside of music. They also spend time in that class doing reflective writing on their 4-year integrated learning experience, including learning objectives for the institution and the department. These two new courses integrate with liberal education core requirements at my institution. Both are writing instructive at the upper level, which requires that beyond assigning and grading written work, there must be in-class instruction and hands-on work with writing and revision processes throughout the semester. Both are situated in a thread. At our school, we define a thread as a cohort of courses from multiple disciplines that are organized around a common topic or issue. And students must either choose one 18-hour thread or two 9-credit-hour threads. As you can imagine, music history and gender and sexuality fits into the gender and sexuality thread, and music history of the environment fits into the environment thread. This provides music majors with options to double dip those credit hours in those respective threads. I'd like to talk a little bit about the pedagogical research that led me to design these courses. NASM accreditation says it provides flexible guidelines for content, repertories, and methods and competencies that are to be shared by the entire degree program, not just music history. And at the AMS 2014 panel, Don Gibson pointed out that NASM does not require coverage of the 6 historical periods, nor does even mention any type of historical period. In the article, High Impact Educational Practices, What They Are, Who Has Access to Them, and Why They Matter, George Koo, I've isolated 3 of the high impact learning practices. About writing intensive courses, Koo says that students are producing and revising various forms of writing, and that parallel efforts are often happening in oral communication and information literacy. With regards to undergraduate research, Koo points out that courses can be reshaped to connect key concepts and questions with students' early and active involvement in systematic investigation and research. Koo says that we can involve students with actively contested questions, methodologies, and the overall sense of excitement that comes from working to answer important questions in our field. And with regards to diversity and global learning, who says that these types of courses help students explore cultures, life experiences, and worldviews different from their own. They often involve what he refers to as difficult differences, such as racial, ethnic, and gender inequality, or continuing struggles around the globe for human rights, freedom, and issues associated with power structures. In their article, From Teaching to Learning, A New Paradigm for Undergraduate Education, Robert Barr and John Tagg talk about strategies for empowering active learning. They talk about that through student work on a project, that students are able to control and direct inquiry, discovery, and the construction of knowledge. And then as an interactive coach, the instructor facilitates carefully designed in-class learning processes. Parker Palmer, in The Courage to Teach, talks about an idea that he calls teaching from the microcosm. Carefully selected content becomes a vehicle for students to develop skills and competencies used by practitioners in any given field. Palmer says, quote, "In every period of history, there is an event that, when deeply understood, reveals not only how historians do their work, but also illuminates the general dynamics of that great epic. What students discover by examining this microcosm, then another, and another, can eventually translate into literacy in the discipline at large. Rather than tell students everything scholars know about the subject, bring them into the practices of that field." Parker then provides a metaphor for this concept of covering the field, which he says unconsciously portrays teaching as the act of drawing a tarp over a field of grass until no one can see what is under it. The grass dies and nothing new can grow. Finally, I was inspired by using Kay Kaufman-Chalamet's Soundscapes textbook in my World Music Cultures course. And I saw that this idea of a case study approach can help students better understand relationships between music and culture. Both of my courses utilize a case study construction. And each music history course comprises multiple case studies. One case study focuses on a single musical work. Sometimes it's thoughtfully paired with a second one. Just can't help myself. And each case study has multiple 70-minute class periods. And in these class periods, students are engaged in developing music research skills. These skills are practiced and applied by completing required work before class, during in-class activities and discussions, and through scaffolded research and writing assignments that culminate in their argument-based research paper. For the historical context class period, students research information about the historical period, genre, and performance practice, looking at, as well, through the lens of intellectual history, developments across disciplines, including musical developments. Wait till we get to the illustration part. I understand that's a tall order. For preparing for one 70-minute class. They use textbooks. And then in the stylistic analysis class period, they use the elements of music to analyze a piece. And to guide their preparation, I provide a handout that they could use for each of those elements of music style. And I provide some terminology, and I suggest that they use the Seton textbook to look up the words so that they're looking them up not in a dictionary, but in context of what's being discussed in that concise textbook. The article or chapter class period requires students to understand, analyze, and critique the information, research methods, and writing that's found in a scholarly publication. I'll illustrate with the Edgar Varese Desert case study from Music History, The Environment. Students read the very brief prelude to the 20th century from the Markov and Bonds textbook. And then in the Seton textbook, they read the introduction to the second half of the 20th century. They also read discussions in the Seton textbook about transatlantic US modernism, experimental music, and electronic music. In the stylistic analysis class period, for this particular piece, article or chapter class period, they studied Denise von Blon's Empty Spaces on the conceptual origins of des arts in a collection of essays published about Edgar Varese. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the repertoires that's used for the case studies in both of the classes. And this is not meant to be an exhaustive list of everything that's covered, but it's meant to illustrate the variety of musical works, which include and extend beyond so-called art music. In music history, gender, and sexuality, the students engage in art music from 3 historical periods, as well as blues, hip-hop, pop music by drag queens, hip-hop, yeah, sorry, a musical by Stephen Schwartz, and film music. And then in music history and the environment, there are varied 20th century art music styles, some of which reference genres from earlier time periods. The piano character piece, the mass, and the symphony. There is also film music as part of a non-narrative film, and popular music. Finally, students do what I refer to as a journal project, focusing on period style and genres. This provides connection with the breadth and context of the survey. I select genres from 6 periods and provide them with an exemplar composition for each of those genres. And the students need to locate and summarize information about the genre in the piece. This is spread over the 2 semesters, so in music history, gender, and sexuality, they cover genres from the Middle Ages through the Classic period, and in music history, the environment, the 19th century to the present. In conclusion, music history, gender, and sexuality, and music history, the environment are grounded in the scholarship of teaching and learning. They integrate with liberal education core requirements at Nebraska Wesleyan University. They're simultaneously connected to the context of the survey, historical survey, while also using diverse repertoire to engage the students in practicing and using music history research processes. And the students are building and strengthening their writing, research, critical thinking, and presentation skills. And as my 8-year-old daughter would say, it results in the best papers ever. Thank you.
Now open the floor for some questions and comments for Brian and for John.
Thank you both for your really interesting talks. Louis Epstein again, Sample of College. I'm curious to know, given that you've already performed this change and switched away from the traditional survey, what plans you have or the ways you've already assessed the outcomes of the change? And for those of us who are maybe just starting this process, can you suggest ways to reassure colleagues that that students are going to come out with the same or different or better outcomes than before?
Sure, yeah, thank you, Louis. It's a really very good question because assessment is a large part of anything we do, but particularly when you're thinking about a large-scale curricular overhaul, such as a completely redesigned major. For us, what we are looking at as far as assessment to see kind of the old major versus the new major. One thing we didn't change with any of this is our capstone project, kind of the thesis, the final outcome for the seniors. They have the option of undertaking a research-oriented historical or ethnomusicological project, a theory analysis, a composition, or a performance recital. And depending on which track they end up choosing, they'll work with a different advisor. And so those final projects, whether it's the recital or where they would write program notes to accompany it, or it's a thesis paper, those kind of final outcomes remain the same. And so I think one of the things that we're going to be looking at as we move forward with this, and again, we're just in the first year of it, is to see, okay, are those capstone projects still at the level that we expect, and
graduate student, I helped pay my way through school by tutoring a lot of graduate performance majors for their entrance exams in music history, and then some of the same ones for their oral comprehensive exams when they were ending their degree programs as well. And so I'm curious, in some of the curricula that we've seen, if you have students that plan to continue as graduate students and go to a more traditional conservatory or school of music to enter a master's or a DMA program, do you have that conversation with students at some point? Are there objectives in your courses where you're not just feeding the students fish, but you're teaching them how to fish so that they can prepare for these exams, so that there's not a whole lot of people like me out there who are making a lot of money off of it? But I'm just curious if you've had that conversation with students, and if there's anyone here in the room who represents an institution that issues such exams, if you have any response to some of these suggestions, if you feel, how you feel like that communication can perhaps be bridged for us as a discipline and how we approach teaching music history.
I spoke with a colleague at an institution that offers such exams for their students, and it began a thoughtful conversation about how some of the problems associated with graduate history entrance exams, which was covered in a NASM proceeding from 2011 by Cynthia Cyrus, if I'm remembering correctly. One of my colleagues said to me, he said, well, you're actually preparing them for graduate school, not for the graduate school history entrance exam. And he said, thereby preparing them for the processes that happen in graduate school, they can prepare themselves for the graduate music history entrance exam. I also feel like that journal assignment gives them a skeletal bare bones of the survey that becomes their preparation. And I'm really open with my students about that.
One of the things that we deal with within our small liberal arts music department at Colorado College is that not very many of our students go on to graduate studies in music, and the ones that do, this is where that really close one-on-one mentoring needs to be in place over the course of the 4 years that they're involved with the department. Is if a student comes to me as a first-year student and says, I want to be like you, I want to be a professor. First I say, no, you don't. And if you do, then these are the things you need to get yourself into the strongest possible graduate program, or be able to find the program that is right for you if you want to continue doing and being involved with what you love to do for a very long time. So we have these conversations early on. A student that comes to me in their senior year and says, I want to go to grad school next year, because generally they don't really know what to do after they get done with college. Then we have to kind of sit down and say, okay, well, what are the next steps? For example, we have a lot of students who are pre-med and music double majors, and they can't complete all of the necessarily things that they need to get into medical school. So they will go to the University of Colorado Springs, which has a much cheaper tuition and has science classes that don't unfold in 3.5 weeks, and take the courses that they need to, so they can kind of also learn what they need to learn on their own, but also find other outlets to fill in the gaps. And so what we try to do with some of the students in music that need to fill in those gaps is work one-on-one with them and do individual work to kind of, if they can't cover everything that's in the survey, or they haven't gotten, a session, or they don't know anything about Bartok, for example, that, I can sit down with them and we can work through that. We can do an independent study block where we can kind of cover and fill in the holes that they might have.
Could you gentlemen talk about the processes by which your institutions arrive at these marvelous innovative curricula? And I'm especially curious, how did the sausage get made? How do you get to these places? And then I'm also curious whether the priorities, the institutional and the departmental priorities were did you have to have a lot of fights about that?
very collaborative effort though, and talking with a lot of colleagues about like getting real about like what are our fears, what are our concerns, how can, because yeah, what about praxis for music education students? What about grad school entrance exams? And I think the more people I reached out, what about NASM? And then I learned about NASM. It's not a straitjacket.
Do we still have the microphone floating around? Yes. Eric?
I just wanted to address the initial question about graduate entrance exams and so forth. We're currently dealing with that issue. And I have to say, I teach at Bowling Green State University, and we have a really great 3-semester survey of music history. Ends the first semester of their junior year. And yet many, and I'm embarrassed to say this, many of our graduates going to graduate school at BGSU can't pass our entrance exam. And I think it's because they just forget it. If they had it all, but they forget it, and if they don't study for that entrance exam, they don't pass. So I'm not sure it really matters whether we have a survey or whether we have topless courses or capstone classes. Students are going to have to study for that exam, no matter what undergraduate program they have. That's just the thought.
Hi, thanks for your presentations. I'd just like to also suggest that even without changing the externals of the curriculum, that is, without changing the names of the courses, we could change our teaching strategies. And that's what we've tried to do in Indiana. Is, we still have history of music from bone flutes to yesterday. And we've, as there's more and more recent stuff, we've moved the division between the two classes from 1750 to 1800. We could move it to 1850, you know, we could keep moving it around. But what we do try to do is to make sure that as we're going through the content, we're really trying to build skills. And I really like the ideas of case studies and of focusing on our own model that is decoding the disciplines, trying to make sure that students understand what music history is. One of the things I've been trying in the last couple of years is a dozen themes, so that music and meaning, how music conveys meaning is a theme, words and music is another theme, and musical context is another theme. And we don't do all 12 themes every day, that would be confusing. But when we get to Jaskin, for instance, I say, so one of the themes of the day out of these 12 is music and meaning. And can you remember the last time we talked about that? We haven't talked about that since ancient Greece. Now, why might that be? And so we start forming these connections over the whole. And I like the outcomes that we're having of combining a framework that does cover everything. I mean, at least parachutes into a lot of the parts. At the same time that we're trying to address these skills of actually getting the students to come up with the content themselves.
Could I ask a question about assessment in these classes? I wonder, I imagine that moving toward a skills-based, project-based, case study-based approach, you're going to do a lot more with written problem-solving, presentation-oriented assessments, but are exams gone from your classes?
I love tests because I like to think I'm good at them. And when I taught my first class in graduate school, I learned how to not give tests, how to not be so extensive, and I even varied the way that I tested. And I don't have any tests in these classes.
historically oriented courses, my jazz history class, for example, when I teach, say, the first portion, we still do have courses that, kind of follow the history sequence. Those are still part of what we have as the part of our major, but they're only required to pick one of them. So, for example, when I teach what used to be the first part of our survey of medieval and Renaissance music, the only kind of tests they would get would be random kind of reading tests, because they have to read so much to get through. We used the short version of the Burkholder, and they had to get through 1 or 2 chapters a day, which is a lot of coverage, but I also didn't have time even though we had 3 hours to meet, we didn't have time in class to go over everything that was there, listen to everything that was there, so I would spot check it through kind of, just reading tests, but never at the end kind of comprehensive test, because again, it was this project-based set of assignments, which requires a different sort of set of assessments, and the more that our students across campus are doing these project-based assignments, they're getting more used to kind of the expectations and what needs to go into those.
I do essay tests, which are a grading nightmare. But you get inside their heads and you see what they're putting together in things. They're in class and they walk out like this.
Always end up a few of those. I think this is a good time to shift towards conversation for the large group, not the small groups, but the large group of those who have been active participants here, whether they've been presenting or discussing and sharing ideas from the audience as well. And so we have some very big questions up here. I do just want to throw in real quick the just-in-time teaching. Some of you might be familiar, called JIT. One of the approaches to that is that students are assessed before they come to class, and they do an online quiz for the reading assignment, and that's built into their participation or their attendance. And sometimes that means that students are able to work on active skills in the classroom, but they have some knowledge to bring to it. Because sometimes when we emphasize the skills so much that we don't have content, then we're asking students to ask big questions and provide evidence for those without the knowledge that they need to be able to do that. So that's one way that I think you can build an assessment, but also have students cover a lot of material and be able to devote that precious class time to doing some skills. But let's all think about these big questions for the last phase of this evening session. What are you excited about? I'm just curious if anyone saw a model or saw an idea from one of the presentations today that you are considering, like you're going to come up and talk to them afterwards because you've been thinking about something similar, or maybe you're working on something similar. I'm just curious if anyone in the audience wants to share that.
Thanks. I actually found a lot of this exciting here, but one thing that particularly was Vilda's talk about how our course objectives make it possible to be inclusive without being tokenistic. And I've certainly found that to be the case. I remember when I was revising the textbook and sent out a proposal and wanted to include in the anthology for the first time jazz and Latin American music and a lot of stuff that was not represented before. And we got back very strong feedback. There are other courses for this. We could go to jazz.
the suggestions about sort of field trips and field work and the archival trips, actually getting students there. And this gets at something, and I'm admittedly speculating. I don't claim to be an expert on this, but I'm drawing partially just on my own experience as an undergraduate music major and now into the graduate level, looking at it from another perspective. One thing that always struck me about music history was that it is compartmentalized. The nature of the music major compartmentalizes it. It's compartmentalized conceptually. This is a different kind of course. It's given a different number. It's maybe ML instead of just MUS. It can be compartmentalized spatially. I know that at IU, the musicology and music theory officers have their own wing in a separate building. And it was similar for my undergraduate too. There was just that one part of the building. That's where the music history and music theory professors were. And our avenue, the way we engage with music history, we've talked about it all this session, is the classroom. And our fourth question here on the sheet itself is, what steps are you going to put into action for your classroom? And this is just purely speculation, pure crapshoot, but does a music history survey and music history more broadly have to end in the classroom? And maybe that is one of our next steps, just finding ways to get ourselves out of the classroom and become sort of ambassadors in music schools and more broadly just in musical communities. So how can we do that? How can we actually take our approach and integrate it in other spaces that are not traditionally our spaces? To integrate it with other people in music making that aren't traditionally the kinds of people we might interact with in these conversations. I don't know. I don't have any answers to that, but I just wonder if that's just a question to ask and if it contributes anything to this dialogue. Thank you.
I'll just respond to that. I think you're right that we have to model things that we want to see. I mean, they always say be the change. I know that in the past I've often had some heated discussions with some of my colleagues in other disciplines, both within music and external to music. And sometimes a better way to find those solutions is to have the students in my music history class go into the experience of one of the performance faculty who's giving a recital, and we're gonna look at those works, and we're gonna do the students will do like a collaborative lecture recital, or do a talking before the recital. And sometimes I think that you can model that interactivity with your colleagues in other disciplines and how music history can go out, like you say, outside of the classroom, and the students will, if they see you do it, that's the best. You know, that's gonna show them more than you can ever tell them, or say, well, this is important to your studies as a performer too. You can always say that, but show them. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think we're all thinking the same thing. Who's here from another time zone? I think we've had some great ideas shared tonight. We've had some wonderful presentations. How about one final round of applause for And having been to this AMS pedagogy sponsored session a couple times now, I really love that we have these models where we have presentations, but we also have participatory elements. I think it's a great thing for us to do as a pedagogy centered panel and evening. So I really like the way that everyone set it up. I'm not taking any credit for it because I joined this party about an hour before it started. But I think it's fantastic how you organize this, and I hope that we continue seeing